Wood basics. Let's look at the various uses of wood, how we deal with things with wood, some of the terminology that we need in order to be able to deal with wood. We start out talking about grain. In wood, the longitudinal arrangement of wood fibers is basically what we would call the grain. The grain is normally seen as growth rings. This is a piece of plywood where it's been cut off in a thin layer from a rotating trunk of wood. You can see the grain in it and the patterns of the growth rings. We talk about hardwood versus softwood. This really has little to do with how hard or soft it is, but this is more of a botanical separation. Hardwood is defined as wood that comes from a dicot type tree. This particular tree is southern live oak. You can see how it's an absolutely magnificent tree. It's got a lot of wood in it, but it's a dicot. It comes from a nut that is produced. It's a dicot, so it's a hardwood. This is a type of oak as well. It is a hardwood. It comes from a dicot. Maple is a dicot. These are all types of hardwood. We also have softwood. By definition, softwood comes from a plant that is a gymnosperm. You can see these both look like pine trees. The one on the right is a lodgepole pine in California. It was a very tall tree. The other one is a Norway spruce. This was growing in New Jersey. You can see that it's full of pine cones in there that are basically maturing at this point. Softwood comes from a gymnosperm. Hardwood comes from a dicot. It really doesn't go back to whether or not there's any real difference in the density of the wood. Let's look at wood uses. Lumber. By definition, lumber is wood that has been processed into boards. We also have what we call a veneer. A veneer is a thin lumber section produced by an angled, continuous, tangential cut. What they often do is they will take a tree. Larger trees often get processed into large boards. Sometimes larger trees get processed into veneers, depending on the type of wood. When you process a veneer, what you do is you take the tree and you spin it on a lathe, and you use a long blade to come in and cut very thin sections. These sections can then be polished up and cured up and used to coat furniture so that you get a thin layer of real wood on the outside to enhance beauty. You don't have to use an entire board to be able to do that. Here we have a picture of a lumber yard. You can see boards all over the place. These boards are different lengths. They're different sizes. They're cut differently. These particular ones look like they are all pressure treated, which means that they have been treated to try and reduce rot if they are in a place that gets moisture on them. This is the end section of lumber. In this particular case, you can see that these materials have been cut into a specific size. You can see that the corners have been rounded a little bit. They come from younger cuts of wood. You can actually see the amount of growth rings on them. You can get a fair idea of how old these particular pieces are when they are processed into something like this. These become the general type of material we use for lumber. We also have what we call composites. Composites are made of other pieces that are put together. We've got plywood, we've got strand board, we've got particle board. Plywood, you take veneers of wood, you run them where one will go in one direction, the next veneer will go in the next direction. The next veneer goes in the same as the first. You stagger these down. You glue the material together. What it does is it gives you a very large sheet of wood that is made up of several plies. They call it plywood. We have strand board. This is called OSB or oriented strand board. They take the wood, they chip it up into strands. They mix the strands with glue, and then they press it together to make strand board. We've got a video on how that happens. Then you've got particle board, where they take small particles, sawdust, and other things like that of wood. They mix it together. Now, each one has its different, if you look at plywood on the end, you can see the various plies. Notice it's got material going deep and from side to side. You can see the ends of these materials. It shows you what that looks like. You can count the layers in here making up the plywood. Here you can see the joint in between some of the layers. This is strand board. This dark area in here, a separation between one board and the next. They take these strands, they glue them up, and then they press them together to make this board. This is particle board. this has a very uniform, unique texture to it. There's not a lot of strength in particle board that you would get out of something like plywood or strand board. It is a much more refined material that you can cut and tailor in certain ways in order to be able to make things. These are composites. They are different ways of putting material together. We also have what we call manufactured lumber when we deal with composites. Manufactured lumber is where we take smaller pieces and we make something larger out of it. This is a board that they are selling. This board is made of little pieces of wood that are glued together to make this larger board. You can take young wood and produce something that's large instead of having to wait forever for something to grow up to a certain stage or certain size before you could remove larger pieces of wood out of it. You can see the gap, the joint in between these two pieces. Each one of these pieces is about 1.5 inches to 2 inches in height on this. You can see the joint that's made between these. These are called finger joints. They cut these and then they take the material, they treat it with glue, and they stick it together, and they press it up, and they form your board out of it. Another thing we make out of wood is paper. Paper is nothing more than taking the material, grinding it down into smaller pieces. And this is not too much different from the way you would make particle board. It then gets cooked. When I say cooked, I mean cooked under pressure. That separates the individual fibers in here. You can see this is a mass of cooked wood. It makes a fibrous material like this, and then it gets pressed out into paper. It comes out in a very thin dimension, and that gets made into paper. Paper is also a very interesting form of wood. When we look at wood and uses of wood, a lot of it goes back to lumber, but a lot of it goes to other places as well.